The world was told it was a threat. People were urged to pay attention to the science. Change your ways, your behavior, in order to protect the future. I'm not talking about today and not even really about climate change. I'm revisiting the days decades ago when the ozone layer was thinning, holes opening up. But back then, the world did come together. The threat was met with solidarity and action. And now, with the same kind of talk around climate change, look to Pakistan and the devastating floods linked to increased greenhouse gas emissions. Hear the country's urgent calls for the world to help, both by curbing emissions and by having wealthier nations accept their outsized role in causing the problem, by providing hundreds of billions of dollars to less developed nations bearing the brunt of a warming planet. A tale of two crises, past and present, and the lessons in it all. Welcome to What on Earth? I'm Laura Lynch.
The flood washed away our roads and plants. The village is in danger. People are scared to spend the night at home.
The rain just came down in buckets. And so if it's 7 times more than you've seen before, and there are no gaps in it, neither the soil, the cities, nor our infrastructure has had time to even absorb it.
The whole town is underwater. Nothing could be saved. No food is available, no rice, no vegetables, nothing here. All the people are worried about food.
The world has watched terrible scenes like these unfold in southern Pakistan over the past few weeks. Floods caused by unprecedented monsoon rains and melting glaciers have killed at least 1,000 people and destroyed millions of homes. The monsoons came earlier and lasted longer than usual. It all points to extreme weather linked to climate change. Pakistan is urging other countries to help with emergency aid, but it wants more in the long run for it and for other nations suffering the consequences of a climate crisis they blame largely on wealthier countries. Munir Akram is the ambassador and permanent representative of Pakistan to the United Nations. Ambassador, hello.
Hello.
I know that you're far away from home, but I'm wondering if you can give me your sense of the damage to life and to property in Pakistan.
Well, estimates are that about 33 million people have been affected by this disaster. 1/3 of the country is underwater. 6 million people are destitute. There is obviously difficulties in reaching people in inaccessible areas. 5,000 kilometers of roads have been washed away, 250 bridges have been destroyed, and therefore the task of relief is obviously difficult. And we will soon have to move to rehabilitation, to rebuild houses, to revive jobs, repair canals, and provide health care, prevention of waterborne and communicable diseases, provide protection to children who have been orphaned or who have been separated from families, and then, of course, move to the task of reconstruction.
And I want to get to all of that, but I'm just wondering, has this disaster had any effect on you personally? What are you hearing from your family and your friends back home?
Well, I come from the province of Sindh, which has been the most heavily affected. Our farm has been basically washed away. 45 families have been rendered homeless. They are still underwater. So, of course, we are trying to help at the personal level as well, because this crisis is a personal crisis for many Pakistanis, including myself.
What has caused all of this massive flooding?
I think it is quite clear that this is a consequence of climate change and global warming. In the months of May through June, Pakistan had temperatures which were 3 to 5 degrees Celsius above the norm that was there 50 years ago. The climate scientists say that the tipping point for climate change is 2 degrees Celsius above the mean for the last 100 years. We have already crossed that tipping point. Our temperatures were 3 to 5 degrees above the mean average. And this caused melting in the glaciers, There were outbursts of floods early. And then, of course, the precipitation caused by the extreme heat resulted in the torrential rains, which were non-stop for almost 3 weeks. So we were literally inundated. 1/3 of the country is underwater.
So you have a plan to confront climate change and the extreme weather and damage it can cause. Can you tell me about that?
Well, we have been discussing climate change in the Group of 77, and Pakistan happens to be the chair of the Group of 77 developing countries. But in the light of this disaster, we are pressing for a 5-point program to be adopted by the General Assembly and by the COP27 climate conference. First of all, mobilization of the $100 billion per year, which has been pledged by industrial countries as climate finance. 2, allocation of half of this climate finance to adaptation projects, because developing countries are living with the consequences of climate change and deserve adaptation projects. Thirdly, we are calling for a financing facility to compensate for loss and damage that is suffered by countries from climate change. Fourthly, we are calling on the industrial countries to achieve not net zero by 2050, but net minus, inconsistent with their historic responsibilities for climate change. And finally, any programs that are undertaken by developing countries for mitigation, such as installation of renewable energy, that these mitigation projects should also be funded by the international community.
So much of this comes down to the fact that you and the other developing nations say you need much more money to be able to deal with the consequences of climate change, much more money to cut your own emissions, but it's also a question of equity, isn't it?
Well, certainly, because the developing countries are not responsible for the emissions that are causing global warming and climate change. And in order to adapt to the changes, to participate in the mitigation efforts towards a green global economy, the developing countries need financial support and financial investment. And the $100 billion that was pledged 4 years ago by the industrial countries in Paris, that has not been fulfilled as yet. We think that the amount will rise given the larger impacts which are happening. And we also need to find ways of mobilizing additional finance from the private sector in form of investments into adaptation, into mitigation projects, and to also get the developed countries to provide financing for loss and damage, which developing countries are suffering.
But I wonder whether you think that can possibly happen, considering that the $100 billion hasn't even come through yet.
That's true. But, as the COVID pandemic illustrated, that when there is the political will, money can be mobilized, because the developed countries did mobilize $17 trillion into their economies in response to the COVID pandemic. The model that was adopted by the industrial countries to support themselves, that model should be adopted to support the developing countries as well, because we are in this together. The global climate.
I wonder if you really do feel as though you're in this together.
Well, certainly we need to convince our industrial country partners that they are in this together. Today is Pakistan. Tomorrow it could be Canada, or it could be Germany, and it could be other places, where climate change will creep up, either slowly or with dramatic impacts, as has happened in Pakistan.
We have had some dramatic weather here as well, so I understand what you're saying. But I suppose the difference for Pakistan is that it's just not as able to handle that kind of extreme weather and climate.
Absolutely. I mean, we are a developing country. We are a poor country. Our per capita income is a fraction of the richer countries, the US, Canada, others. So our capacity to respond is obviously much more restricted. And developing countries will not be able to respond without international solidarity. I think we saw that in the pandemic. And I think climate change is even a larger existential challenge to all of us. And therefore, we think that the political leadership in the industrial countries must wake up to this fact and try to build structures of international solidarity, because unless we cooperate, unless we have support, climate change is going to defeat us.
I'm wondering what your fellow diplomats from Canada and other wealthy nations say to you when you raise these points.
I do not see any disagreement. There is a recognition among all those who have studied the issue that, yes, this is a global problem, it's a global challenge. And as the UN Secretary General keeps saying, we have attacked nature and nature is fighting back.
What specifically must Canada do now when it comes to the catastrophic loss and damage your country is suffering?
Well, I think Canada is a developed industrial country. It has got its own capacities, both financial, technological, and humanitarian. Canada is also a member of the G7 countries. These are the countries, if they were to guarantee the mobilization of finance from the market, they could do so. And of course, Canada, with a progressive prime minister, a progressive government, is well placed to take the lead in forging such a consensus among the industrial countries and then making this into an international campaign and international support.
There is one thing that to me sets Pakistan apart from other developing or poorer nations, and that is you have a wealth of very well-educated, brilliant scientists, engineers, and yet the infrastructure just is chronically underinvested in, and especially along the Indus River, which is used to irrigate much of the farmlands, probably your farmland. I'm wondering if your country should accept at least some of the responsibility for the scale of the disaster.
Yes, this point has been made, and of course we can do better in building our infrastructure. The question is, of course, infrastructure is usually built through investment, and so far that investment has not come to Pakistan. We do not ourselves have the kind of magnitude of resources required for that massive infrastructure investment. The only infrastructure investment we've got so far is from China.
I hear what you're saying about wanting to attract more investment, but you know as well as I do that a lot of Western investment is wary of investing in Pakistan because of corruption.
Well, the fact is that corruption exists in many countries. And I think that you could not say that Pakistan is the sole example of corruption. Development and investment is taking place in many countries, despite corruption. Investment in India. Do you think that corruption in India is any less than Pakistan?
So what do you think is the problem then? Why is there not enough investment of the kind that you say your country needs?
I think partly it is our fault that we have not focused sufficiently on ways and means of attracting investment, in having good, viable projects developed to present to private investors. Partly it is a function of the financial system, where credit rating agencies are very subjective in the way they judge various places for investment. And I think that it is also that investors are very, shall we say, cautious about putting money into developing countries. And this is not only Pakistan. Infrastructure investment is only going to a handful of developing countries. And I think that there is something wrong with the system, where we are unable to channel investment into the majority of developing countries. The point is that the frequency and the magnitude of climate impacts is increasing. When we had the floods in 2010, a bridge over the river Swat was washed away. We rebuilt that bridge 16 feet higher. Today, that bridge is underwater. So the impacts of climate change are becoming more serious. These floods are exponentially larger.
Ambassador, I thank you for your time, and I wish only good things for your country. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Now, I know the conversation around money for less developed nations can be bit confusing. So here goes. I'm going to try to clarify it. There is, of course, the long-awaited, yet-to-be-delivered promise by wealthier nations, including Canada, to provide $100 billion every year to help countries like Pakistan both transition to cleaner energy and adapt to the effects of global warming. And that's not supposed to be available now until next year. But there's another chapter of the money issue that's become so contentious and so urgent for these nations with relatively little, which emit relatively little, but who suffer the most from this changing planet. They want to be able to tap into the riches of nations like Canada. They want to be compensated for what they label their loss and damage, to have a ready source of cash when disasters hit so they can react, rebuild, and prevent even more devastation and death. And I'm not just talking about money from governments. They also want the private sector, which has often profited off the backs of these poorer countries, to contribute its fair share as well. It's something that's not going over well with some, and that's why it's expected to be a central topic at this year's Climate Change Summit in Egypt in just a few weeks. Eddie Perez is the International Climate Diplomacy Manager for Climate Action Network Canada. He joins me now to break this down just a little bit more. Eddie, hello.
Hello.
When you see the scale of the disaster unfolding in Pakistan, where does your mind go?
For me, what we saw in Pakistan is both shocking and also politically horrifying. It actually exposes how in 2022, we actually have not yet created a system that is able to respond to the devastation that Pakistanis are experiencing with these floods. But it's also terrifying because the question that always comes to my mind is, which country is next?
Right, and because there are other countries that are also vulnerable. But just to stay with Pakistan for now, the government of Canada promised $5 million in humanitarian aid for the victims of the floods in Pakistan. What do you think of that promise?
I think we need to separate two things. The humanitarian community is one that is prepared, that is doing an amazing job with very little resources. But we're talking about a devastation of a country that is not responsible for the climate crisis. And at this moment, those $5 million, while they can lead towards action that is needed at the local level, they are really, really inadequate to the size of the responsibility that Canada has, a wealthy and major emitter country, in response to the losses and damages that we're seeing.
And let's get into some more of that, because last year the Canadian government doubled what is called its international climate finance commitment to $5.3 billion over the next 5 years. And that's Canada's share of that long-standing promise by developed countries to provide $100 billion each year in climate finance to developing nations. How satisfied are you with that commitment?
So essentially, I think the decision to double climate financing was a good decision. While the amount still remains far from Canada's fair share, it is a very good way to enhance climate funding in the upcoming years.
Okay, so that $100 billion, it still actually hasn't been fully realized yet, but it is earmarked for adaptation and mitigation efforts. But as we heard from Ambassador Akram, developing countries say there's a need for separate funding for losses and damages that have been caused by climate change to their countries. And that should come from wealthy nations that have been big emitters. Why have wealthy nations like Canada been reluctant to commit to that additional funding?
Because when we talk about addressing losses and damages caused by the climate crisis, we have turned that debate into a toxic one. The United States, for the past decade, has always linked those ask for loss and damage funding to compensation and liability. They have always said that the attribution for these losses and damages does not fall into the shoulders of wealthy countries. And that has led to actually ignoring and actually pushing away the discussions on loss and damage as an issue of international solidarity.
Okay, how do you move forward, though, when there is so much fear about that idea of liability, of lawsuits, of opening them up to all kinds of damage claims?
Well, I mean, we did see openness from Minister Guilbeault. He said in the summer that he wanted to change that discussion. He said it to the National Observer, we're not there yet, but we do see openness to address this issue at the highest possible level and create a system that actually helps people in Pakistan have support.
It's a great idea, but how do you do it then and remove the liability from it? What's the structure that you have? How do you decide who gets how much and when?
We need two things. And this is something that the developing countries themselves, the island states, have been asking. We need to have a system, a mechanism within the climate convention that is able to discuss these issues. Think about it like an institution in the UN that is actually focused on addressing losses and damages. At this moment, when communities in the global south, they would want to have funding for solar panels, there are institutions out there where you could apply for funding to install solar panels in these communities. When communities in Africa or Latin America would want to invest to build seawalls or education programs to inform people about adaptation, resilience, and health, there are mechanisms out there where you could apply to get this funding. But there is absolutely nothing where countries could apply or seek for funding when it comes to climate disasters. That's missing. So the first thing that we need to identify is, how do we fix that?
Let's try to push this to a real life, real time example. If this agency or institution exists, how would it operate to help Pakistan?
The human rights rapporteur on climate change, Ian Fry, has actually just published a report where he is actually giving us some kind of options. One of them is using the existing financial institutions that we have at the moment, for example, like the Green Climate Fund, as a channel so that immediate funding could be allocated through it, because this is a multilateral fund where all developing countries could apply immediately for funding. So that could be one solution. But then the other one is that we also need to look at what is out there. The different humanitarian assistance programs where countries could come and ask for funding when these immediate disasters happen, and then bring them all together so that their response is rapid in the context of climate change, and not only takes into consideration the immediate, but also all the process of recovery at the local level. And then have a discussion at COP27 to identify what else is needed.
Are you concerned, though, that there may not even be any discussion of this at COP27 in Egypt?
I think there will be. And I have an idea of what's going to happen, because you talk with the Pakistani ambassador. He is also leading the G77, the biggest group within the climate convention. And they have put forward a request from all the developing countries asking for an agenda item to discuss financial arrangements for loss and damage. It is the first thing that countries are going to discuss, because it is part of the agenda debate that happens on the first day of COP. And so that debate is going to happen, and the whole world is going to be watching. So loss and damage is going to be that first thing that is going to signal if there is trust among countries. That is where I see Canada playing a big role as a bridge between the developing countries and the major emitters. And then from there, I do feel that if this agenda item is adopted, all the COP27 outcome is going to be shaped around the possibility of fixing the system so that it's fit for purpose in response to climate impacts. So I do feel that people are preparing to make COP27 a loss and damage COP.
And if that happens, will it fix the problem?
Well, it won't necessarily fix the problem. We are in a hell of a mess. The losses and damages that we're seeing are happening everywhere. This needs to be an issue of global concern. Look at what's happening in California at the moment with the heat waves. Look at what happened in British Columbia last year. Look at what is happening with the heat waves in China. climate-induced disasters are increasing. By taking a decision at COP27 that there is going to be an institutional body where countries could apply for funding in response to these losses and damages, that is going to be a first response that as a global community we can come together and find this kind of solutions.
Eddie Perez, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, we contacted the Office of Canada's Environment and Climate Change Minister, Stephen Guilbeault. In a written statement, it said the minister is listening to his counterparts from other countries and promises more details in the coming months at multilateral meetings, including the COP27 gathering in Sharm el-Sheikh.